that takes us to our second keynote address by Dr. Rumman Chowdhury. So let me introduce her here. Rumman is the director of Meta at Twitter, which stands for Machine Learning, Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability, and predates the other Meta that you've been hearing so much about these days. She's a general partner and co-founder of the Parity Responsible Innovation VC Fund. She's a leader in the field of applied algorithmic ethics and has worked to develop solutions for ethical, explainable, and transparent AI. At Twitter, she leads a team of applied researchers and engineers to identify and mitigate algorithmic harms on the platform, which we're very much hoping to hear more about. And previously, Rumman was the CEO and founder of Parity AI, which provides algorithmic auditing tools to companies, connecting really nicely with our second panel of the day. Prior to that, she was the global lead for responsible AI at Accenture, where she led the design of the Fairness Tool, first in industry algorithmic tool to identify and mitigate bias in AI systems. She's also deeply engaged in AI global policy. She's a board member of the UK Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation and serves on the UNESCO Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development. She has also been an advisor to the UK House of Lords Parliamentary Group on AI. Rumman, welcome. And please feel free to share your screen when you're ready.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me here. And thank you for the warm welcome and introduction. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Rumman Chowdhury. I'm the director of a team known as Meta, ML Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability at Twitter. I'm also founder and GP of the Parity Responsible Innovation Fund. So in my experience, both as a political scientist, which I am by training, as well as a data scientist, which I am in practice, I'd like to talk a little bit today about reimagining AI systems governance. So in the theme of radical shifts in policy and how can we think more radically and differently about how things are done today and how to reimagine the world. So just as a bit of a background for folks in the audience who may be a little less familiar, so the current state of algorithmic ethics and regulation, the research in the field dates back much further, but the field of applied algorithmic ethics is only a few years old. And contrary to popular discourse, regulation isn't behind. It's actually moving rather quickly. And there's this phenomenon known as the Collingridge dilemma, or also there's an aspect of it called the pacing problem that regulation needs to avoid. And essentially it boils down to this statement. When change is easy, the need for it cannot be foreseen. When the need for change is apparent, change has become expensive, difficult, and time-consuming. In other words, when the area to make policy and regulation was very simple and easy because nobody was interested in it, it was very hard to figure out 4 years ago whether we should be regulating about the future of work or whether we should be talking about self-driving cars or whether we should worry about children's minds in schools being warped by algorithms. We have no idea. Today, we have a clear definition, understanding of the harms that can be introduced by this system. But of course, that means that these systems are significantly more entrenched and much more difficult and time-consuming to do anything about. So the Collingridge dilemma basically states that technology changes exponentially, but social, economic, and legal systems change incrementally. So the graph here pretty much illustrates Moore's law, and political change and social change moves much slower. I will say there is a reason for that. It should be that way. A society in which political, social, and economic structures are constantly shifting is a very insecure and unstable society. We want democratic systems that are incremental, that are actually taking in a wide range of thoughts and opinions and leading to change that is not so drastic and dramatic that any negative externalities cannot be dealt with, and that any other change is unforeseen. So that would actually be a worse world than one in which our regulatory systems, our economic systems, and our social systems were moving at the rate of Moore's law. That would be a very, very frightening and disorienting world to live in. But that being said, there is a growing AI governance imperative. So this KPMG study points out that 94% of IT decision makers said that they feel firms need to focus more on corporate responsibility and ethics. I'm going to pause on that term, ask you to remember this term, corporate responsibility and ethics. But we are actually seeing movement from top down and bottom up. We're seeing regulatory movement by the EU. We're also seeing strong indicators in the US from the FTC, and we have a plethora of standards bodies, including the standards bodies, NIST, ISO, et cetera, as well as entire new groups and organizations that are spinning up just to talk about algorithmic ethics. We do have a crystal ball. A lot of us in tech, including those of us who work in responsible AI, sometimes have a bit of hubris about our field, and we think we're the first people to have ever encountered a certain problem. That is untrue. We have a crystal ball here of GDPR. We know how regulation may go. So there is one world in which we have GDPR-like regulation. I will tell you, having been on the industry side after GDPR is implemented, this is what we saw. Companies will be slow to adopt. There's a massive gap between regulation and implementation. There's a huge ability and skills gap between what the law called for and what companies were actually capable of doing, not because of malicious actors or people actively not wanting to comply, but quite literally, it's easy to say the right to not be found, and it's easy to say the right to access your data. Implementing those two mandates is incredibly difficult. How can you ensure that every piece of information about an individual will not make it into any aspect of your systems if they have elected into the right to not be found, even information that you are maybe collecting secondhand or thirdhand? This is not to say that companies should not comply. It's to say that regulation needs to be written in a way that is sensible, not just for people, but from an implementation perspective. And also, I will add, law does not ensure compliance. I think sometimes we do live in an idealistic world in the field of responsible AI, where we think that if a law is passed, that means it is all done. It is not done. There is a compliance part. And it can very well, like welcome to the field of risk management, it can very well happen that a company can decide, I will take the hit and will not comply because it's more worth it for me to make this revenue. And again, this is not to pass judgment on any group or groups, it's to say this is the state of the world, this is what happens. One issue with existing laws today when talking about algorithmic ethics, and I'm very happy to see Deb Raji presenting here today, is that existing laws lack a clear definition of the term audit while attempting to mandate them. So back to this gap between regulation and implementation. It's even worse than something that would be onerous for companies. What happens if a law is passed that mandates an audit without a clear definition of what an audit is, that is ripe for regulatory capture. It is ripe for inducing monopolies. How? Well, now we have a vacuum of information, and the individuals who will come and fill this vacuum of information will obviously be policy motivated actors who will want to make this law done in the way that would benefit them the most. And in doing so, create a world in which them and the companies like them would be the most successful. So it'd be monopoly inducing. So there is a fear of, going back to this Collingwood dilemma, of being too premature in passing laws before understanding what the downstream implications of these laws are, not just on people, but actually quite literally, structurally, in how we are setting the stage for the ability to have further policy and even the ability to have good market competitiveness. So I asked you earlier to remember this term corporate responsibility and ethics. Flaws in status quo. Framing ML ethics as this concept of corporate social responsibility or corporate responsibility is a failure state. First, because ML ethics will then always be viewed as what you would call in the consulting industry or in many other industries, a loss leader. In other words, nobody ever expects to do responsible AI and ML and have a better product or have an improved outcome. They do it because they have to, they do it because it looks good, and the benefit of it is not actually part of their core business metrics or their revenue. It's sort of, nice to have, and we need to do it so that regulatory stay off our backs. That is not how I want to build my team. It's not where I think this field should be. It results in an uphill battle where practitioners are viewed as the enemies of real engineers, when that is not the case. We're actually here to help build better products, just like everybody else in the room is. So why do we care, and why do these flaws matter? Why am I pointing them out? Well, number one is, in order to actually enact real change, whether in companies or with regulation, we need broader sweeping cultural change driven from the bottom up. Second is we need regulation to help set guidelines for this cultural shift. In other words, we have to all want to comply, and then we will look to regulators to say, well, tell me what compliant is, and that's a good place to be in. And importantly, we're seeing the start of this today. By and large, practitioners are looking for implementable practices, not principles or codes of conduct or anything like that. What people want to know is, in my day-to-day, in my job, what do I do to ensure algorithmic ethics and responsible AI? So here's my presentation of an alternate future reality or better future reality, the one that I would like to realize. So I'm not here just to point out problems, but to help try to make a roadmap. So first principle is ML and AI are not inherently bad things. There's nothing inherently bad about them. Some people actually disagree. Some people think that they are inherently bad things structurally because of what they are and what they represent and what they may, sort of by design entail. If one thinks that, then this is not, you do not want a responsible AI team, you want an AI abolition team. If you do want a responsible AI team, the first principle is that this is not a bad thing. We're not here to fight product teams. We are actually here to improve the quality of products that are built. And this is how to meaningfully engage a team like mine. First is being engaged in go, no-go decisions, being the individual in the party that represents the conscience, the ethical use, and being the people who are the most skilled in the room at understanding what the ethical implications can be and having that viewpoint respected. Second is what we need are community-driven standards to bridge reality and aspiration. And again, back to the danger of having regulation that does not adequately understand or define what a company would need to do to be compliant may lead to a worse outcome than not having done anything. So we need community-driven standards development to build reality and aspiration. I think this is key within what Divya is going to be talking about. Third is addressing the socio part of the socio-technical system. So what does this mean in terms of the context of deployment? When this model goes out into the world, what is the impact it has on individuals? We're talking jobs, income, livelihood, et cetera. This is why intrigued by Andrew's UBI. What does it mean to actually supplement individuals so that they are not so worried about this apocalyptic algorithmic future taking away their jobs, which some people very much are. Next is ensuring meaningful ownership of data and interaction with product post-launch. Again, back to Divya's presentation. Ensuring proactive harms identification to limit reactive harms mitigation. So back to what Deb's talking about, algorithmic auditing. So how can we make sure that we're not just ambulance chasers? We're not just trying to find the fire and then putting it out, but we're stopping fires happening. Very interested in Francis's presentation on middleware, because a lot of this can rely on third-party groups and entities that are better equipped and engaged to answer this than companies can. And finally, developing the right standards and regulations that speak to how practitioners do their work. How can we create sensible regulation? So how do we get there? Education, democratization, empowering specialists, and meaningful regulation. So the first is education, which I think has been a topic of conversation that many people have. I won't spend too long on it, but I will add something very specific, because there is a difference between education and training. And I will credit my team's PM, Yuta Williams, for teaching me the difference between education and training. Education is what most groups provide, which is a high-level 30,000-foot view of why should you worry about algorithmic ethics. Fortunately, with many folks, we are past that stage, and now we need training. And what we need is very clearly context specific in your job and what you do in the day-to-day. What do you need to do to play your part in algorithmic ethics? And this is very, very important, because one phenomenon I increasingly see is this concept of moral outsourcing. Paradoxically, when a team like mine exists, when an ML ethics team exists at a company, policy folks will agree with this, legal folks will agree with this, and security folks will agree with this, and privacy. The average engineer may think they don't have to worry about this anymore because that's what we are here for. That is untrue. We are not here to handle end-to-end every aspect of potential ethical missteps. Everybody plays a role in this. So training helps educate people on their role to play. It is a company-wide endeavor. Everybody has a role to play. Training provides people an understanding of what they need to do. Second is democratization. So I'm going to specifically talk about tooling, but we can also talk about whether access to data or understanding what models are being used and being able to interact with them and opt in and opt out. But I will say for the average data scientist, there is a significant amount of open source tooling. Is it fully encompassing every single thing we should be addressing? No, it is not. But is it a good place to start? Absolutely. And we are seeing the most common cloud-based ML platforms implementing some of these technical interventions. So aside from the qualitative interventions, the product and design interventions, we do have actionable things that an average data scientist can do. And at a larger scale, companies and organizations, as they move into this ML ops and standardizing their productionization of data science models, they can think about the idea of responsible ML ops. So what does it mean to standardize at every stage of the productionizing process? What are the checks that need to be done, and what sort of things should be monitored and tracked? Next is empowering specialists. So as I mentioned, for engineers, we have open source tooling, et cetera. But then there's the aspect of responsible AI that is about the socio part, the context, the humanity. And this is where critical voices in non-engineering functions need to be elevated and hired. We need folks that do deep user research, and they need to be working side by side with product, not just to share product improvements, but actually to talk about, meaningfully what it is people want and how best to implement it. And finally, reevaluating team placement in the org and incentive motivators. A big topic of discussion is how do we get everybody on board with this? We have already seen in other industries, the best place to motivate change is to do it in ways in which people are incentivized in their day-to-day jobs, right? I think in Silicon Valley, we love to think that our jobs are our identities, but for many people, it's a job and they show up and there's no problem with this. They show up and they do what they're supposed to do and they go home at the end of the day. Well, that's fine. But then we need to think about where ML ethics teams are situated. For example, my team sits in an engineering function. And in doing so, my counterparts are people who are building products and tools and building the ML infrastructure for the company. It was the same at Accenture. It puts you in a very different place than if you sit in a completely different part of the company removed from product. And second, incentive motivators. We saw in DEI, the best way to move the needle was to tie compensation and promotion to the diversity of a team. Well, how do we ensure that avoiding ethical missteps or identifying and mitigating ethical harms is an incentive motivator, and it's something that is tracked and rewarded when people are able to take these actions? And finally, the concept of meaningful regulation. I want to talk a little bit about some work we did at Twitter this year. We've been doing a lot of work on identifying and mitigating bias, but important, and obviously a lot of companies do this work. What we are trying to do is figure out how to be transparent and share in the open and talk about the challenges we face in doing this work. It is my concern if we end up in an all or nothing world where we have to provide a perfect outcome, otherwise everything is tanked. That is not how anything works, and that's not how change happens. So, our biggest example of this is our algorithmic bias bounty. So earlier this year at DEF CON, which is a big hacker conference, we introduced a bias bounty challenge that was inspired by security bug bounties. My first time at DEF CON was 3 years ago, and I was so surprised to see industry, big companies opening up to anybody who wants to, opening up their tools to anybody who'd want to hack at them. And if they found a problem, these individuals find a problem, they get rewarded. And this practice does not exist in responsible AI. In responsible AI, what we find is people do the work. There are graduate students, there are lay people who are interested, who do the work of identifying harms in models, and they're not rewarded for the work they do. And even though they are net making these products better, they're making everyone's experience better, and they're inspirational for a lot of folks who work in industry. Well, we instituted the first bias bounty challenge. We took our image cropping algorithm, we created a rubric that we would grade it by. We even opened the rubric to the public for critique. And we held a competition, and we were amazed at the outcome. And I'll tell you a few reasons why this starts talking to community-driven knowledge and community-driven regulation, as well as efficiently and rapidly incorporating a diversity of opinion. So we had 30 plus submissions. So it was a 1-week challenge. We had 30 plus submissions from over 10 countries, which was not something we could have replicated on our teams, right? So our teams in Silicon Valley do not have the diversity, global diversity, income diversity, educational diversity, racial diversity, religious diversity, you name it, that we would want to have if we are to say we are making a fully inclusive algorithm. But in opening up to the public and giving everybody the ability to poke at what we are doing and giving them a structured way to provide feedback, we got thoughts and opinions from folks ranging from graduate students to startup founders to one of my favorite, which was, I call it a citizen data scientist. In other words, not somebody who didn't know how to program or code. And what they did was they padded a few images on a pixel, and they demonstrated how they could change where the model was choosing to crop the picture by selectively placing pixels, something one can do in Microsoft Paint or Adobe Photoshop. So, that was an example of our first place winner who created a custom-made StyleGAN algorithm, essentially, to hack our model, to our most generalizable winner, who was a citizen data scientist who used no coding and programming. So we got a diversity of opinions. We were faced with questions and challenges that were above and beyond anything our team could have produced, which is wonderful, in such a short period of time. But importantly, and maybe most importantly, one of the most interesting things that came out of it was we have a community tested rubric. We put this measurement tool out there and we ask people, use this to identify issues in our model. Because as we within industry proceed to do this work, it is hard for us to understand how to create the best measurement tools and assessment tools to identify biases and harms. And that is only half of the step. The other a paper that we have released in the last few weeks identifies that there is algorithmic amplification of the political right on Twitter. I choose those words very carefully. Algorithmic amplification does not mean algorithmic bias. What we see is that a certain group of people are, their content is shown more often than another group of people. Why that is happening, it's very complex and very interesting, and not something we know the answer to yet. And it's something we are embarking on over the next year as a significant area of inquiry to understand where it is coming from. Why am I, kind of raising this point and talking about it quite a bit is, again, back to this idea of a socio-technical system. If this is a function of user behavior and people's contributions and what people are talking about, that is very different from saying algorithmic bias, which is baked into the DNA of how this model is built. So we need more diverse discussion that comes from the bottom up, and that helps drive meaningful regulation. That helps drive a world in which we are actually listening to the needs that people are surfacing. Companies are involved and they're able to actually switch and pivot their products to be more effective. And regulators are in a world in which they're not chasing down violators and they're actually working with companies and individuals to provide meaningful and helpful regulation, and especially regulation that will withstand the test of time. Back to this idea of, we need regulation that reinforces stability and resilience. It's incredibly important that we think about how our regulation is constructed, how it's done meaningfully. So in conclusion, I'm extremely excited about today's talk. So I alluded a bit to how they relate to the topics that we're raising today. And overall, I was thinking through thematically, what are some common themes that I see in all of these presentations, all of these radical policy ideas? And there are three, and they're actually, interestingly, three attributes of healthy complex systems. And they are resilience, self-organization, and hierarchy. Resilience is incredibly important. How does this complex system react to stress? How quickly is it able to rebound and heal itself? That's step one. Two is self-organization. The most efficient way to organize and create a durable solution is actually to enable self-organization of the atomized entities. So as we think about individuals or third-party groups being engaged in auditing models or determining for themselves how they want their data to be used, we are enabling and allowing self-organization. And finally, hierarchy, which one may think is at odds with this idea of self-organization, but it's actually a natural byproduct. So, in creating a data collective, one can have a data advocate, which is an individual that is a trusted individual who represents your needs. And what you will notice is good hierarchy and resilient hierarchy moves from the bottom up, and that's really critical to see. So I'm extremely excited for today's talks, and also let's open for a couple of questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for that keynote address, Rumman. We do have a fair number of questions, so let me go ahead and start with the first one, and I'll combine two of them. The first one is by Irina Asmundsson, who asks, how do we have community-driven change when end-user license agreements can limit the exploration of how algorithms work to internal or limited external auditors, which connects really nicely, I think, to the proposal by Deb for algorithmic auditing. I think, let me combine that with kind of a second question, which is, you had mentioned this really interesting work on the amplification of political content. And as I understand it, Twitter is also committed to trying to provide that data for forms of replicability, which is a really interesting move. But we've also seen how challenging that can be in this space. If you think about the sort of social science one initiative that has gotten stymied by sort of privacy constraints. So tell us a little bit more about how Twitter or you are thinking about that kind of data access problem that Irina points out.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you sort of put it into two parts, because they are actually two parts of the same question. So for the first part of the question, it's I'll put on my startup hat. When I had my algorithmic auditing startups, actually a pretty common concern, and it's valid, and we're not just talking about big corporations and small people. Let's also put it in the context of mergers and acquisitions or vendor relationships. If I am a big corporation and I want to assess the ethical, whether or not there's algorithmic bias in a vendor's models that I want to work with, right? For example, let's think of any major tech company licensing any recruiting company, all of which are using machine learning and AI models. What's to stop this big company, if they have access to all of their code and IP, from just replicating the work themselves? That's a genuine fear. It's actually a genuine fear a lot of startups have. And there's no good and easy answer for that. And actually, it is very related to the second question, is how do you meaningfully share data and information? It is something I'm actually working on with this VC fund that I've started, Parity Responsible Innovation Fund. What we are focusing on is investing in the companies that build the backbone, the technical backbone, and the responsible ML infrastructure for companies, which includes privacy and security, compliance and ethics, transparency and explainability. But to answer the question specifically about Twitter, I very much wish I could talk about it, but I can't yet because we've not yet signed all the contracts. But we are extremely hopeful that we will be able to say something soon. But yes, your assessment is correct. Our goal is to be able to ensure replicability of findings as a start, and hopefully more. And we are a little bit in cutting edge technical ground, so really hopeful that it's something we can be more public about very soon.
So Rumman, I'd love to follow up a little bit on the amplification of certain kinds of information on Twitter, political views you mentioned. Also, there was a paper in Science that I'm sure you know, by Dave Roy, your colleague, and Sinan Aral, one of my students, and Vasogi, that looked at misinformation and the spread of truth and false news. And one of the interesting things that came from that, there are a lot of things that came out of it, was that even when they took the bots out and they tried to remove the automated amplification by some of the bots, humans themselves tended to amplify misinformation more than truth. I guess misinformation is juicier and more fun to talk about because it had more emotional valence. Yep. And so part of the problem seemed to be us ourselves, that we were more likely to spread false news than truth. So maybe say a little bit about why it is that certain types of news, certain types of political views, certain types of information gets spread more. How much of it is due to the algorithms? How much of it is due to people? And
yeah,
those trade-offs.
Yeah, no, and you're raising a really great point. Frankly, one of the most interesting parts of my job is the human aspect, right? So that's what we're embarking on over the next year. Is in our blog post, we talk about the what and the why. So in our paper, we've identified the what is happening, what's the phenomenon we saw, and then our next step is to figure out why it's happening. And to your point about your research, which was the research you cited, which is very important. I would actually ask from a policy perspective, what does one do? I would be very, very, very uncomfortable to say, well, we're going to enforce some notion of equitable discourse, even though it is human action and human behavior that is making this happen and is not a technical byproduct of an algorithm. I'd be extremely uncomfortable doing that. And and again, thinking through let's make sure we're not passing.
Let me push back on that a little bit. I mean, I can see being uncomfortable on enforcing different political views, but isn't part of your job to have a platform that amplifies truth more than falsehoods? And don't you think there are any parameters you can do on that?
Correct. Yeah, correct. So I was drawing the link between certain things get amplified more, not necessarily misinformation. If something is cut and dry, not factual, that is a much easier problem to solve. But what do you do when it is an amplification of just someone's opinion that is maybe something that is something that a bunch of people just don't like? And what we looked at very specifically wasn't misinformation, right? It's just sort of politicians on different sides of the playing field and who's getting more amplification. And I will also add that we saw center right, not far right. So we saw more center right amplification than we saw center left amplification. So we are talking about the middle of the road people getting amplified. And again, figuring out why. Like if it is simply because they just engage better on social media, again, I don't know the answer, but if that is the answer, then we have a much more complex question to discuss.
Absolutely. No, it is. I mean, one thing a term I've learned is nut picking. You know that term? So, but now that I've learned the term, I see it all the time on all kinds of social media. Nut picking is kind of the opposite of cherry picking, where you find like an extreme nutcase on the other side and you make them famous. You know, somebody who might have been ranting on the subway or something, who normally would have 2 or 3 people notice them, but suddenly they have millions or hundreds of millions of people who know about this craziness. And it's not false. It actually really happened, but it becomes a great tool for stoking polarization.
That is one of the theories that when we posted the paper, a lot of folks were in my Twitter feed saying this, is they're like, oh, it's because the left quote tweets more than the right. As it's to your point, like people on the left tend to find an account that's saying something absolutely ridiculous and then retweet and quote tweet it to say how ridiculous it is. That too feeds into you are amplifying when you do that. Even if you are amplifying that you dislike it, it is still an amplification. So yeah, absolutely. Now that I know that term. But yeah, there is some thought.
You see it everywhere now. It's one of those things.
Now I feel like I'm just going to thank you for introducing me to it. But yeah, these are the complexities to untangle and the incredibly interesting and rich body of work that comprises responsible AI.
Well, thanks. Let me pose another question coming out of the Slido. A few years ago, you discussed the danger of how anthropomorphization of AI leads to moral outsourcing that you mentioned in your talk, shifting the blame from humans to machines. Can you describe a bit more sort of what you mean by that and whether you think we're moving in the right direction?
Overall, I would say yes, I think we are moving in the right direction. So when I gave that talk was years ago, and it was speaking more to sort of the deification. Well, we are better, we're not great. It's what I worry is that we don't talk about these things like tools and products. We talk about them like these godlike things. The world has gotten much better. I see much fewer, HAL and Terminator and Ex Machina references in policy papers than I used to. Very, very grateful for that. But that being said, there is still sort of like we talk about the algorithm as it is as if it is an entity in the room. We talk about it as if it is this like godlike, all-knowing creature. But none of this is true. We are talking about systems made by people. The new face of moral outsourcing that I'm seeing is the one I alluded to, and again, it is progress, but it is shifting. Where when ethics teams exist, folks who work in product are like, well, this is what you guys are for. Like, we don't have to worry about this anymore. And again, it's a common issue faced with legal, security, privacy. It is not something a single team can do. It is a company-wide thing. Everybody has their role to play. We may be the experts and we're not the ones executing everything. So yes, it is better, but I've also seen an evolution of what that term means.
Yeah, one last closing question. I know you got to run to give another talk. Susan Ettlinger asked, what would you say have been the most effective strategies to demonstrate to your peers engineering that responsible or ethical use of AI in industry is a business benefit and not a tax, something that is kind of a win-win?
Great question. And hi, Susan. It's framing us as improving quality. And framing us as people who are working with them versus people who are working against them. I push back against this notion of the fairness versus accuracy trade-off, which has become a bit of a language in the data science community. It is quite wrong. Can have a whole separate conversation about that. But it is about being a good engineer. It is about building better quality products. I've also been talking about this notion of ethical debt, similar to technical debt, right? If you do not address these issues now, then trying to address them after the fact is significantly harder, if not sometimes impossible. And one may have to tank the entire system if it is significantly too complex to identify where problems are coming from and what you can do about them. So those would be my 3 strategies.
Well, thanks so much, Rumman. I know you have to run, and we're so grateful for your sharing these really interesting thoughts with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much.